welcome to the podcast, Amazing Tales About History. I'm your host, Mike Allen. We've had railroads chugging throughout our country for almost 2 centuries now. In fact, the 200th anniversary is coming up very, very soon. Trains have meant so much to us. They have ruled the roost, at least until we learned how to fly. Now, trains may not be what they used to be in the United States, but you would be surprised to know that you wouldn't have nearly as much to eat without them because they transport a good portion of our food. Our guest today is Chris Holland. She is the executive director of the B&O Railroad Museum in Baltimore. Now, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad holds the distinction of being the very first commercial train operation in this country. The company laid the first mile of track in the United States. Chris has all sorts of great railroad memories for us, and she's going to be along momentarily. Well, you may have noticed I didn't include a trivia question in the introduction this week. Normally you'd hear that question, and at the end of the show you'd hear the answer, and you'd know what the subject would be for next week's show. Well, you see, there isn't going to be a next week's show because after 4 years and 2 months, 221 episodes, I'm ending production of Amazing Tales. You see, doing a weekly podcast is a true labor of love. There's, of course, the fun part of researching, reading, learning about stuff, and speaking with fascinating guests, recording an interview with them, narrating the script like I'm doing now. But there's the behind-the-scenes part you don't see that takes an awful lot of time. You have to find and schedule those great guests. You have to edit the interview to make it flow for your ears, and that's really the time-consuming part each week. Then you have to produce the episode, promote the episode, and anyway, once you get the incredible satisfaction of completing that cycle, you realize it's time to wake up and start that process all over again. Something I've been doing now for more than 4 years. Well, I began Amazing Tales as a retirement project, and now I'm going to enjoy retirement a little bit more. Now, I'll still be doing public appearances, and I might write a book or two about my favorite Connecticut history stories. Now, I'm going to keep my website active through at least the middle of next year, 2026. That's where you can access all 221 episodes and find my public speaking schedule, and the website, of course, is amazingtalesct.com. The many outstanding guests, which are, of course, too numerous to name here, are the secret sauce. They're the ones who made Amazing Tales what it is, and I want to thank each and every one of them for the remarkable, dare I say, amazing contributions that they made. Most of all, I want to thank the thousands of you who have been along with me during this ride and let you know just how much I appreciated every email, letter, and book that you sent my way. You're never really going to know how much that meant to me. All that said, it's time to move on now with the final episode, featuring a topic that actually started me off on all of this, trains. It was the remnants of an abandoned railroad bridge abutment that sparked my initial insatiable curiosity in local history. It was right down the street from a house we had bought in Connecticut and drove by it every day a couple of times, and I simply had to find out where the former train line had gone. Well, my research branched out and led me into more nooks and crannies than I can count. And so it seems altogether fitting that this 221st and final episode should focus on the beginning of trains in the U.S. And that means a visit to the B&O Railroad Museum in Baltimore. You see, while England is celebrating its 200-year history of trains this year, that's where the steam engine was first developed and introduced, the 200-year mark here in the U.S. is not too far behind. Railroads were a brand new disruptive technology in 1830. They displaced horse-drawn wagons, canal barges, even steamships. They ushered in a new and much faster way to carry people and products, and they reduced the time needed, think about this, to deliver a letter from New York to Boston from 7 days to just 14 hours. Well, this shift to the iron horse was perhaps best exemplified in the story of the steam engine, the Tom Thumb. That's the one that raced against a horse-drawn train coach, and, well, we're going to leave that story for the interview. Our guest today, Chris Holland. She is executive director of the B&O Railroad Museum in Baltimore. Her museum has a replica of the Tom Thumb because that race was run on tracks belonging to the B&O. The B&O indeed holds the distinction of laying the very first mile of commercial railroad track in this country in Baltimore, Maryland. So, Chris, it is fabulous to have you on the show. And, in the podcast history of this program, done a lot on trains because I personally find trains to be just amazing and what they have meant to the overall development of society. We don't have to go through all that, but the reason I'm excited to have you on from the B&O Railroad Museum is that B&O was the very first commercial train line in the United States. And I'm not sure everybody knows that, and I hope that do our part to make awareness a little wider at this end. Tell me about this, because I know England started in 1825, right? That's when they got up and running. And B&O was chartered in 1827, then operational in 1828. Walk me through that.
Yes, the B&O Baltimore merchants chartered our nation's first common carrier railroad on February 28th, 1827. So 2027 will be the bicentennial anniversary of the American Railroad. And another interesting fact about the railroad was it was our nation's first public-private infrastructure project. It was chartered by the Baltimore merchants, and it was funded half by the state of Maryland and half by private sector Baltimore merchants. So that's just another interesting fact. But it was chartered in 27. The very first stone was laid on July 4th, 1828, here at the Mount Clair Station on our campus here in Baltimore. They built the first mile of track that opened on August 28th, 1830, and it was the very first mile.
Now, it ended up going, if I have my facts straight, and I may not, roughly 13 miles. Was that the first original, what you might call, route?
That was the first route. It went to Ellicott Mills, which today is Ellicott City in Maryland.
Now, I know in Connecticut, where I'm based, the earliest trains were both freight and passenger. I think passengers were maybe a little bit scared, some of them, to go on it because there were often derailments and whatnot. What was the B&O like when it first got started? Was it catering more to businesses or passengers?
It was catering more to passengers. So the B&O was actually our nation's first luxury passenger rail. I mean, it also did freight as well, but while the Amtrak is not direct lineage to B&O, B&O was first passenger train, and the B&O was luxury passenger service.
Chris, one of the reasons, and I almost hate to admit this, but one of the reasons I was so familiar with B&O was because I love the game Monopoly, and I played it all the time. And it was one of the four railroads, along with the Pennsylvania, the Reading, and the Short Line, and you always heard B&O. And yet it turns out that all those were near Atlantic City, which, of course, is what Monopoly is based on. But nevertheless, B&O was far ahead, I think, of those other two, the Pennsylvania and the Reading, and Short Line was actually a trolley line, wasn't it?
Yes, and the B&O did actually go into New Jersey. What's interesting today is that in preparation for 2027, we do plan to release a Railopoly 200. So it would be a Monopoly board game, but dedicated to 200 years of railroading. So for all the rail fans that want to see Monopoly and play Monopoly, but focused on important places around the country where significant rail milestones occurred.
Wow. Now, one of the many things you do to keep this alive at the B&O Museum is you actually still have that mile of track that people can actually ride. Is that true?
That is true. We do have the first mile of commercial track, and we call it the Mile One Express, and we offer rides to people every week. And we have visitors from all 50 states and typically 40 countries because it is a historic preservation. People want to ride on that first mile of commercial track in the country.
Now, I don't want to exactly wax romantic here, but when you go back to the age-old debate between horses and the iron horse, this was the B&O story, and I'm not, again, sure that everybody understands this. So when the B&O got going in 1830, right, that first mile, correct me if I'm wrong, but it was horse-drawn at first, right?
It was horse-drawn. The very first rail cars were pulled by horses. So there was a legendary race that occurred on August 28th, 1830, and it was between the Tom Thumb, which was designed by Peter Cooper. It was between the Tom Thumb and a horse-drawn car. Legend has it, because this is a legendary race, was that the B&O had taken its directors to Ellicott City, and the Tom Thumb ran at around somewhere between 12 and 14 miles an hour, and that was very fast for that time. People were very scared. They say that on the return trip, the Tom Thumb got in a race with a horse-drawn car, and that the Tom Thumb was originally winning. Then, it blew a belt, one of the blower belts shifted out of place, and it lost, and the horse won the day. But it still showed everybody, because the Tom Thumb was winning, that, it may have lost the day, it may have lost that particular battle, but it won the war, because then, it showed everyone that you can move to steam. And that's when steam engines started coming into play.
And I'm one of those people who would prefer to think this was absolute fact, irrefutable, but I understand it's a legendary story. Nevertheless, after this supposedly occurred, the board of directors did switch from horses to iron horse, correct?
They did, yes. And you start to see the advent of steam. Though what's interesting that a lot of people don't realize is that a lot of major cities, like Baltimore included, would not allow steam engines to come in to the city. So it would stop at city lines, and they would be then pulled, on their own power. They would be pulled in by horses. So the B&O had horses, stable for horses on its property for, quite a period of time while that restriction was in place.
Now, I understand that, assuming that Peter Cooper's original Tom Thumb did exist, and this is a true story, my understanding is that not too long ago, about 100 years ago, I think 1927, a replica of it was built. Tell me that story.
It was built for the Fair of the Iron Horse, and we have that replica still today. Fortunately, the B&O and then, CSX ultimately, after, several mergers, had the foresight to keep the collection pieces from the Fair of the Iron Horse in 1927, the very first 100 years of American railroading. So we do still have that. And I don't know if you know or not, but Peter Cooper, a little cocktail trivia party for you, fact is he also was the inventor of gelatin, which would be modern day Jello. So if you look at the Tom Thumb and Jello, they had the same inventor.
Not a lot else in common, but nevertheless, the inventor is, so I'll take that. Wow. Wow. When you talk about all of the advancements that have occurred in the railroad industry over 200 years, they're just too numerous to name. But one of the things I've always tried to focus on is the importance that refrigerated cars made for the trains, because back in the 1800s when they first came in, you had, at least in Connecticut here, you had dairy farmers who couldn't move their milk beyond what a horse and wagon would take them before the milk soured, and there just wasn't much else to do about that. But once they started putting in some of these new train lines, and putting things like ice that they would harvest from the ponds during the winter and store with straw, and sometimes salt was used, that they could actually refrigerate things. But B&O was one of the pioneers in a brand new technique from, I think it was the 1990s, called cryogenic cars. Could you explain that?
So absolutely. So the cryogenic cars, if you think about the history of perishable goods, most goods were first moved with Conestoga wagons. So, that meant they really could not preserve perishable goods, and they could only go so far. So when we did get with the railroad, some of the very first refrigerated cars, and they were filled with blocks of ice, and they were called reefers. which allowed Americans to access perishable goods a little bit beyond their local regions. By then, the early 1900s, we get the new mechanical reefer cars, which use fans to circulate the cool air. And so that's when we start to see fruits like bananas, for example, became Americans' favorite fruit still to this day due to the railroad, because they would come into the New Orleans port, but now they could come up to the Baltimore port and they could be moved throughout the country. And that, became a way for Americans to have it. And then, yes, we went from that to then cryogenic cars. The rest has been history. I mean, people do not realize that so much of our perishable food is loaded around the country via rail. I like to say to people when they say, well, I don't take the train, I always say, well, everything you use and own does.
Now, one of the things when you talk about celebrating the history of railroads, railroads have also participated in the history of the country in terms of celebrations. And one that comes to mind, of course, was the bicentennial of the country in 1976. And I guess over really a year and a half period there, from April of 1975 through 76, there was what was called the American Freedom Train. And could you tell me what that was all about?
Sure. So the American Freedom Train was a symbol of unity, and it was a train that went around the country to celebrate the bicentennial of the United States. And over 7 million people saw that train as it went around the country. And it was really a train museum. Here at the B&O, we have one of the locomotives that pulled that Freedom Train, but the train itself, it had everything that was the best and most symbolic or important of America. Iconic documents. It had, the Declaration of Independence, the U.S. Constitution. It had the Gettysburg Address, but it also had things from American culture like Judy Garland's dress from The Wizard of Oz, and Joe Frazier's boxing trunks, and JFK's rocking chair, and Jesse Owens' gold medals. And it truly was the best of America over the last 200 years. And so for America 250, as I said, we do have that original locomotive, and we are restoring it cosmetically back to the AFT1 paint scheme, which has a huge, presidential mural on the side. It's absolutely an amazing steam locomotive, and we're going to be unveiling it in January 2026.
What is the reason why Chris Holen is at the B&O Railroad Museum? Is it because you just love trains and it's so exciting, or you're a museum professional who just happened to get into the train field?
I think it's a combination, because, what I find really amazing about our museum and trains in general is that if you look at our museum, every car, every building is connected to a significant event, person, or place in American history. And so we like to say we tell the story of America through the lens of the railroad. And I'm always amazed at what we have and the connections of the railroad. I mean, the railroad was the internet of its time in terms of how it transformed American society, economy, and culture. I mean, it was transformative, and it was born only 50 years after the birth of the country. So when I see trains go by, I think about the history, but I also think about the fact that today, in modern times, the railroad facilitates over $2 billion a day of economic commerce. For me, it all started right here in Baltimore.
Well, that wraps up this episode of Amazing Tales About History. I want to thank our guest for today's program, Chris Holen, Executive Director of the B&O Railroad Museum in Baltimore. Well, again, thank you all for listening, and I hope to be able to meet many of you at one of my upcoming public speaking engagements. Please don't be a stranger. Come on up and say hello. Remember, that schedule's on my website at amazingtalesct.com/talks. Amazing Tales About History is a production of True North Associates, LLC. This is Mike Allen. Be safe and please stay healthy.